Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. And this time around, based on the responses in the first video, we are going to be doing the High Elves. And, well, this is a faction that definitely is interesting. I would say they're in a pretty good spot balance-wise. There are not too many what I would call overtuned or insanely good High Elf units. At the same time, I don't think there are really too many weak ones. I think the High Elves in general are in a pretty solid position. I think you can make use of most of their units, and most of their matchups are also relatively well balanced. They definitely have a few skewed in their favor a bit, like Wood Elves or Vampire Counts. Definitely a few that are skewed out of their favor a bit, like Bretonnia. But in general, they're a well-rounded, well-balanced faction. I think their roster will definitely uphold that. But we will definitely be diving right in here and seeing where everything falls in their roster and how reliant they are on some of these units. So regardless, we are going to start with the Everqueen herself, of course. She's an easy S tier. I'm sure nobody here is surprised that Alarielle makes S tier. She's insanely powerful, but she's got great selection of spells. She's got great passives. Her only really weak item is her Stave of Avalon, I believe it's called. It's one nobody ever brings, that improves Winds of Magic and reduces miscast chance. Maybe sometimes people do bring it, but it's very rare. It's generally not considered worthwhile. But besides that, she can grant AoE physical resistance. She's got, of course, the Star of Avalon, which is insane. Arguably, probably just straight up overpowered at the moment and probably needs a bit of a nerf, but very powerful. Free heal. She has Faw's Protection. She can continuously cast Life Bloom as well as Shield of Safri with her cheap spells like Faw's Protection and Earthblood, which is very beneficial on a global scale. She also does get Tempest, which is definitely nifty to protect herself in the air. She's a decent melee combatant. You can throw her up on an eagle for good mobility. And she's not terrible in combat, so she's just very well rounded. She also grants units potentially magic damage, which can be great against factions like Bretonnia, for example. Not terrible against, for example, Vampire Counts or Wood Elves, actions like that. She definitely can be a very strong choice. Next up, we do have her best mate here, her lover, I guess, Tyrion, and he's nowhere near Rail's level. In my mind, he's an easy D tier. And a part of this is because the High Elves have very strong lord choices, and we're going to get to some more of those in a little bit. But the simple fact is the greatest High Elf duelist out there is just not that good. Tyrion is survivable. He does bring a tiny bit more utility than, say, the Green Knight with Sunfang. He can clear it out sort of blobs of chaff. The problem is he's still a pretty pricey lord. You still have to bring a caster with him. His actual ability to get on top, like, for example, maybe he is able, and I haven't done these tests, but like, he is a very capable combatant. You can put him into a fight against a lot of big monsters or a lot of enemy lords, and he will beat the crap out of him if he's given the opportunity to. Like, he can fight a lot of big monsters, like dragons and whatnot, 1v1. That's not really a problem for Tyrion, because he's got insane stats, he's got Faint Riposte, he does actually have Stand Your Ground that he can use. The problem is getting him into positions where he can do that is incredibly difficult. He doesn't have the mass to plow through enemy formations and really get into a position to utilize his damage output. You can definitely bring him and get occasional results out of him, but I think as far as the High Elf roster goes, it's very rare that you're going to want to bring him. I just don't think he's bad. He's not bad to the point that he's F tier and like you never want to bring him unless you're memeing. I could see builds where he is a bit viable if you just want a tanky lord that can kind of fight. But in general, I think he's usually going to be a weaker choice. So definitely D tier, probably leaning a little bit more towards C tier, but definitely on the lower end of the scale here. Next up, we do have his brother, who is actually going to make S tier here again. And you might be surprised that we have two S tier lords, but I think it is a fair assessment. Now, I know a lot of people like Alarielle, and she's kind of the premier meta pick, but I actually don't agree with a lot of people view her as just straight up better than Teclis, but I don't actually agree with that. Teclis is significantly cheaper than Alarielle, which is really nifty. He has, in my opinion, an arguably better selection of spells. Flaming Sword of Ruin, except Chain Lightning, essentially every single one of his spells has a usage, and he can cover a lot of the High Elf weaknesses with them. He's got Net, so he can prevent enemies from disrupting your backline too easily. He's got Enfeebling Foe, which lets you goon out or win difficult fights. He's got Flaming Sword of Ruin, which grants you magic damage and fire damage. Very useful against certain factions that are vulnerable to those things. He's got Regrowth, which is stellar at supporting big single-entity monsters. Now, Alarielle obviously does have her own ability to do that, especially with Star of Avalorn. The problem is, Alarielle is much more expensive than Teclis, especially if you want to bring her with decent kit. But you can bring a stripped-down Teclis for absolute cheap, nothing cost. He also does have Kindle Flame, which is situational synergy with with some high elf units, like for example the Phoenix, of course his own Flaming Sword of Ruin, Sisters of Avalorn, the Fireborn, units like that. So he's got some great synergies there, and in my opinion is a very potent lord choice. He's just the budget caster option, but still very, very powerful, still very, very viable. He's got the Potion of Troy, which makes him incredibly tanky, despite the fact that he's a dirt cheap lord choice. He's got the Scroll of Hoeth, which is incredibly powerful as well. One of the things, Alarielle, if she wants to disrupt someone's cooldowns, going into a fight, like say you're fighting the Hyle or the Bretonnians, and you want to go into a cavalry fight, the Fey Enchantress, for example, can be a huge problem. She can immediately give her troops a bit of a burst in support. She can give them the Favor of the Fae, she can give them Regrowth, Earthblow, that sort of thing. Alarielle, to counter that, would have to hit her with a Arcane Unforging. This is incredibly expensive, Winds of Magic wise. It's a stupidly expensive spell, and it'll do like nothing to the Fey Enchantress, because the Fey Enchantress is basically immune to magic damage. Teclis can hit her with the Scroll of Hoeth, he screws up her Winds of Magic regen, and he denies her that casting ability, and it costs him nothing, which is great, and it is another reason I really like Teclis. His only real downside, in my opinion, is that he is a little less mobile. He's only got 78 speed on his horse, so not the most agile, and he can get caught. He's definitely not a very good combatant, so you can't rely on him for that. So he's cheap, so there's that. And finally, the bound Fiery Convocation is trash. This simply it needs to be fixed at some point. I don't know. Fiery Convocation needs a buff, or it needs to be replaced with bound Fireballs like he gets in early stages of the campaign. But at the moment, that's just the only real downside to him. Just like Alarielle has the Stave of Avalorn, which is kind of trash. So just some things to keep in mind, but I do think Teclis is an S tier. Next up, we do have the High Elf Princess. She's going to make a stable B tier. I think if you're going to bring a combat lord, like a true combat lord as a High Elf, you are going to bring the Princess. She's got almost the same combat stats. First of all, when you bring combat lords as High Elves, it's generally going to be on a dragon. You don't bring them on a horse. You don't bring them, except Tyrion, of course, who you bring on Malahandir almost always. But you'll almost never bring, or Belethadar, who you can't bring on anything. But my point is that if you're going to bring a combat lord for the High Elves, one of the two generic lords, you are going to bring him on a dragon. And in this situation, the Princess has almost the same stats as the Prince. She's got a bow, which gives her some free, or not free, but because she does, of course, lose some melee stats and she gains the bow, but which gives her some easy chip damage, in my opinion. She gets the Moon Dragon and Star Dragon rather than the Sun Dragon and the Star Dragon, which in my opinion is a better choice for your lord, since it gives you a slightly budget combat dragon, but not complete cheap garbage the way it is with the Prince. I just think it synergizes a little bit better, but because you usually want your lord to be a bit more sturdier. She's in melee, she's basically just as good. You've got the Flight of High Arrows, which is really nice, does some damage. Her actual combat items and whatnot are not that good, but just the ability to do chip damage plus decent melee stats, in my opinion, makes her a bit better than the Prince. If she just buffed shooting and didn't shoot herself, I feel like she and the Prince would both be probably around the same tier. The Prince would probably be a bit more viable, but because she does have the advantage of the shooting, it does make a bit of a difference for her. Next up, we will touch on Elithanar, everyone's favorite edgy elf. And he's actually going to go D tier as well. I know there are a few niche builds where you can make him work. Once again, he's a very niche pick. One of those things where you can make him work if you really put the extra mileage into it. He can counter snipe enemy artillery, alright. He can do some chip damage to enemy cavalry, for sure. The problem is that bringing a lord, you still have to bring a caster with him. Because, of course, he's just a straight combat lord. He's basically inept in melee. His decoy is not particularly valuable, in my opinion. And, in fact, most of his items are pretty useless, except like the moon bow. So you bring a stripped down version of Elithanar, but you still have to pay for a caster. High elf casters are pretty expensive. Now they've got some great items, but they are expensive, so it's a bit of an issue. And Lithanar, he just doesn't give you the utility you need. It's much like he's not a reliable shot. This is actually a big complaint that we've had for ages now and has not really been touched upon. He can do decent damage if he hits. The problem is he often isn't hitting. He's often getting disrupted, shut down. He's only on foot, so it's not like you can. It's not like a Glady or a Glade Lord or the Princess for that matter, or a Dark Elf Crossbow Lord. This or what's his face? Luther Harkon. Lithanar's trapped on the ground. He's not that cheap. It's not like a Waystalker where he could be paid 700. It's just a hero. You're paying like probably about 1,500 or so for an average at Lithanar, I would say. And in that situation, he just doesn't pay for himself, in my opinion. Which is unfortunate because he's pretty cool. His lore's pretty dope, but I don't see him above D tier. You can make him work in niche builds. He's not as abysmal to be an F tier, but I think he's D tier. Next up is the Prince, and this guy's also going D tier. So we've got 3 D tier lords. The Prince, basically, like I discussed with the Princess, the Princess just edges him out. So like in basically almost every case you'd bring a Dragon Lord, you're going to bring the Princess over the Prince. He does have some cool melee buffing items. Yeah, maybe he's C tier. I don't know. Maybe he's definitely on the edge. All of these lords, I will say, are a bit on the edge of the like upper D, lower C tier. I think he is a bit more viable than a Lithanar and Tyrion, just because you can get him on a big Star Dragon and get some crazy buffs. Sort of like the Red Crested King Chief a little bit. You can make him a bit more of a competitive combat choice. I just don't think he's quite up to snuff with the Princess. Another big problem for the High Elf combat lords is the fact that they overlap a good bit with the High Elf Noble. One of the big problems the High Elves have is countering big monsters, and the High Elf Noble is insanely cost efficient. And so generally, if you're going to bring, instead of bringing a combat lord, you bring a caster and double up on nobles, and that's a much more cost-effective combo usually than bringing a caster, combat lord, and a noble, for example. Which does bring us to the High Elf heroes. And first and foremost, we have the Noble, and this guy is an easy S tier. Useless on his Eagle. That's like the one major downside to this guy is the Eagle mount, which is trash. So you never bring that. You don't bring him on foot either, but you put him on a horse. He's an insanely good, cost-effective anti-large counter. You put him on a chariot, he demolishes infantry for days. Probably one of, if not the best, single-entity chariots in the game. Especially because he's so cheap. Single-handedly obsoletes the Ithilmar chariot, and that's why you'll basically never see it. Or one of the big reasons you'll basically never see an Ithilmar chariot. It has some decent items as well. Not the best items, but he does have the Sacred Incense, which grants 12% missile resist in an AoE. Not bad. Keep in mind, heroes have a baseline of 15%, so you get another 12% on top of that. You're up to 27%, and you can buff an area around him with that. So definitely a solid choice. Has a lot of versatility. There isn't really a matchup where the Noble is not good, in my opinion. You can get value out of a Noble no matter the matchup. Probably, arguably, this guy's more of a consistent performer than Teclis and Alariel, which might come across as surprising, but I think there are a few matchups where someone like Alariel or Teclis might be a little suboptimal, whereas in the Noble, I feel it's like never suboptimal. You could always bring one or two of them. Which does bring us to the Handmaiden, and she's a bit of an oddball. I used to view this as a basically useless hero. I've done some testing recently and found her to have some niche. There are a few matchups where she can perform okay. She can be useful against, for example, Bretonnia if you go with a very frustrating kite build. She can chip away a heavy cav over time for sure. She does have a bonus versus large against squishier monsters where you don't need that AP necessarily. She can do all right in melee. Some of you guys probably saw me bring 2 of them against the Greenskins where they ended up carrying the day. Though probably a Noble would have been better. I do think it's a solid C tier for the Handmaiden. I think she has more niche uses in a few specific matchups than, say, Tyrion or Lithanar. Definitely nowhere near the level of the Noble, but there are a few specific compositions that I think really utilize her well. She also does have some nifty ranged buffs, though these usually don't come into play. The problem with the High Elves is that you really don't want to blob your backline, because that's a quick way to have it compromised and destroyed. And this is another thing that screws over both Lithanar as well as the Handmaiden. And in fact, it's something that extends to other ranged support heroes. Ones like the Dwarven Engineer. The fact is, you don't want in this game, you don't want your shooting clumped at all. It's a stupid move. It's a very it's a potentially disastrous move. End result is heroes that are meant to support ranged in AoE tend to fail to do so. There just isn't enough incentive to do it. So that is another thing that hurts the Handmaiden a bit. She does buff ranged attackers a bunch, but just not in the way you really care. Most you'll be buffing like one unit. Next up, we do have the Lore Master, and this might be a bit of a controversial placement here, but I'm actually going to put him at C tier, because I think there are a few matches where he can be viable. I've actually seen him used to some decent effect against Bretonnia with his magic resist item, which surprised me. It was actually an interesting pick. It wasn't something I expected, but he's proved surprisingly effective, because it was a combination of a Lariel plus a Lore Master. I mean, in the match, to describe it, my opponent used, this was a while ago, granted, so Lariel was more OP back then. I think this was before the patch where she was nerfed, or Star of Avalon was nerfed. But my opponent was using Spirit Leech and the Magic Resist on Lore Master, and it actually proved relatively effective. Supposedly he's also decent against the Dwarves. He definitely has a few niche matchups where he can perform very well. Definitely bordering on C to D, probably closer to D tier, I guess. I don't know. He's right here on the cusp. It's very difficult for me to say. I don't think he's terrible. He's definitely not F tier. On the cusp of D, maybe D tier. It's a very sort of right on the edge, but I do think he's maybe I'm a little over exaggerating here, and he is a little worse in my opinion than Handmaiden, but still pretty decent. Next up, we do have the High Elf Mage, and this one I'm sure some people might disagree with me here, but we're just actually going to give it a B. And I know I've already given a B tier to the Skinks. I've given a B tier to the Bretonnian caster, generic caster. So the nice thing about the High Elf caster is that you can put her on a chariot and she becomes an okay infantry killer. You can put her on a horse, and she's pretty mobile and agile and can escape bad situations. They've got decent selection of lores, all that. The problem is that the magic generation, Winds of Magic generation items on them are very expensive. And you pay for martial prowess, which hurts the cost on these guys a lot. Generic casters for High Elves are, in my opinion, just a bit too pricey. Like, compared to a Damsel or an Empire caster, it's just very expensive to bring them, which undermines the fact that they can be better, say, at generating Winds of Magic or spamming spells. But they just are more expensive, and that's a bit of a frustrating factor. So I don't think they're necessarily bad, and you obviously have to bring them if you go without Teclis and Lariel. I do think that's just a disadvantage that is there. Next up, we do have the Infantry. First and foremost, we've got Spearmen. And these are... So this is a unit that, if it was on any other roster, or almost any other roster, probably wouldn't go this high. The problem is that we're talking High Elves here. And these guys are probably somewhere between A to S tier. I actually think, and there might be some controversy about this, that I will give them S tier. And if this was any other roster, or honestly, if the High Elves had an alternative, cheaper spear unit, I think these guys would instantly tank in positioning, probably to like a B or C tier. Because the fact is, the High Elf Spearmen, while definitely having respectable stats, are very respectable holding stats, especially with martial prowess active. Silver shields, of course, 40 armor, which is on the higher end for cheap infantry. Well, they have all of that going for them. Their actual ability to kill stuff is abysmal. They're extremely expensive at 500 gold for a cheap chaff unit. They're actually not as efficient as, say, Empire Spearmen, leveled up to an equivalent cost. It's just a big problem for these guys. But the thing is, they're basically mandatory. There is the only build where I think Spearmen are not necessary is the Dwarves. And besides that, I think in almost every matchup, you're going to bring some spears because you need to generate that width. You need to have a blocking force. You need an anvil if you're going heavy cav, or a cav heavy if you're if you need width. You're going to bring spears because there's nothing else you can generate width with the High Elves. You need to protect your shooting a lot of the time. This is the best way to protect it, essentially, for the cost. And while I don't think the unit is that great on its own stats, it is a crucial unit for the High Elves. It is a mandatory unit in the, like 90% of your matchups. And so it makes S tier. Even though in another roster, it most likely would not at all. If these guys were in the Empire roster, they would probably be like D tier. It would be a Spearman you'd almost never bring. because you got cheaper and more efficient spears, essentially. But because it's the high elf roster and you have no choice, boom, S tier. I'm sure some of you might disagree, but I think they deserve that spot. Next up, we do have the White Lions of Krace, and these guys are going to get a B tier. They're a unit I personally don't utilize very much, and that's, I would say, is more of a playstyle thing. So I do try to give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't use White Lions very much personally, but I think they... I think they can perform well. They've got the 30% missile resist, which is definitely nifty. It makes them a bit tankier against a lot of missile play and explosive play. They're great against dwarves. They're very mobile for a great weapon infantry. So once you breach a front line, for example, against dwarves, you breach the front line and the dwarves can't outrun you. And this is actually huge. If you play as chaos against the dwarves, you will often find that the dwarves will block you up with cheap trash infantry. And then by the time you butcher that infantry, you're already weakened, you're already softened up by their shooting, and now you're trying to push through, and the dwarves can outrun you. They, like, if you don't have marauders to chase them down, they will kite your chosen, they'll kite your chaos warriors with great weapons, and they'll shoot you to death. You can't do that against White Lions. White Lions are too quick. They'll run you down. They'll beat your ass in melee. And that's why one of the reasons I do think they're stable. They also help in some matchups like Bretonia, where I personally don't run them there, but I know a lot of good players do, and that's why I'm going to give them B tier, because I think that's where they belong. Next up, we've got Swordmasters. These guys are going to get... These guys are definitely on a CD tier cost, I would say, but I'm going to give them a C tier. I think the unit has respectable matchups. Even one or two of these guys can demolish a lot of factions' front lines as long as you're able to protect them. You have to invest a lot into keeping these guys safe. That is probably the key factor to make them work. Obviously difficult. There are matchups, though. You can make Chaos. They can work well. Definitely Greenskins, if you are able to shut down Wall. These guys can be brutally effective. Against... Vampire accounts, they can definitely work, though Phoenix Guard is probably the more meta pick there, but you can do also a mixed bag. I've done a bunch of, I've kind of experimented in that matchup a good bit, and I found Swordmasters can be thrown into that battle. Generally probably less effective or less efficient than Phoenix Guard, but even one or two, it can make a big difference. Dwarves, they're pretty devastating. So you do have a few niches. The biggest problem is they're just squishy. Against any faction that has good amounts of shooting, you don't want to bring these guys because it's basically serving them easy kill. And even against, say, Beastmen, because Beastmen can bring a Cygor, it's a very risky choice. Because a Cygor, unlike, say, a Hell Cannon, you can't shut it down easy with a Bolt Thrower. Next up, we do have Phoenix Guard, and these guys are A to S. These guys are definitely bordering on the A to S tier front of things. I'd probably give them an A tier. The reason being that there's definitely quite a few matchups where you don't want to bring these guys. S tier is essentially units that are reliable. It's a unit that you're going to bring in most games or most matchups and get reliable performance out of them. Phoenix Guard are close to that, but there are definitely a few. Like, you're not going to bring them against Dawi. You're not going to bring them against Empire, most likely, because Empire will probably gun you down or magic you to death. You're not going to bring them against Wood Elves. There's definitely multiple matchups where you're not going to bring them against Vampire or Coast. So there's matchups where you're just not going to bring these guys because they're too expensive, too flimsy still, despite their 30% missile resist and all that. 30% physical resist and fear causing ability, high leadership, monstrous melee stats, and martial mastery, all that. These guys are amazing, don't get me wrong, but for their cost, it's just difficult to justify them in some matchups. And so I think they are an A tier, because in the matchups where you can bring them, they're devastating. They define the Vampire Count matchup, in my opinion. I think the Vampire Count matchup is really defined by these guys, Dragons, and Archer Spam. Those are like the three builds, or mix of those builds that you'll see. And these guys are one of the chief problems for Vampire Counts to deal with. Similarly, they're a huge problem for Norska, potentially. Obviously, Norska has Mammoths, but besides that, they don't have many tools to crack Phoenix Guard. Stuff like that. They can be matchup defining, and that's why they get an A tier. Now, going into the Regiments of Renown, Regiment of Renown Phoenix Guard is actually getting an A tier as well. I think there are some cases where they are worth it, and they can definitely be a solid anchor, but because they don't have... Their ability is kind of meh. There's self-immolation. It's okay. They've got crazy stats because they're rank 9 Phoenix Guard, and they do have magic damage, which is both very good. And of course, they're borderline unbreakable, all that stuff. So they're a very strong unit. The problem is that I think there are also matchups where or situations where you're just going to bring normal Phoenix Guard because normal Phoenix Guard is good enough for your purposes. You don't need to bring, in some cases, you just don't need to bring the Court Guard yeah, they just don't make the cut here. Finally, and I actually forgot to mention them, but Signs of Mathlon, they're actually also going to get an A tier, and you might be wondering why they rank below Spears. Now, there's some very abusive builds you can pull off with these guys where you resistance stack, because if you stack, for example, Lariel plus these guys on top of Phoenix Guard, you've got 11% ward save, you've got 12% physical resist, these guys have a base of 30% physical resist, you're looking at over 50%, you're looking at 53% resistance to physical attacks on your blob, as long as your magic is over 50%. It's an insane buff. It's a bit of a cancerous mechanic, in my opinion, or badly designed mechanic, but it does make Signs of Mathlon very strong in some cases. The problem is they're an 850 gold unit, so there's a lot of situations where you will not want to bring these guys over normal spears because they're just too damn expensive. Paying 70% more for a spear unit that isn't functionally, if you're going wide, these guys only really have a benefit of being a little more sturdier, but you're paying 70% more for them, so that's just not worth it in a lot of games. If you're going for just a nominal front line or whatever, this is probably a waste, and so that's why they actually rank lower, because there are builds where they're insanely strong. There's also just a lot of situations where they're not as mandatory as they're just not mandatory, the way spears are, essentially. So that's why they make A tier. Next up, we do have missile play, and this is, of course, one of the High Elves' big things. Archers make an easy, well, I guess I was about to say S tier, but I'm going to put them at A tier. Once again, they're a very strong unit. They're a very cheap unit. One of the most cost-effective archers in the game, alongside peasant bows. Maybe I should give them S tier. I don't know. They're very strong. I do think that, though, that compared to because the High Elves have more trouble protecting their backline, I think these guys do not rank quite as high. And Illyrian Reavers tend to dominate a lot of the archery play. I don't think these guys rank quite as high as, say, Bretonnian Peasant Bows would. But they're a very cheap, cost-effective archer unit. There's most matchups you can make use of at least a few of these guys, especially if you build for it, go with sufficient width and protection. These guys can do a lot. They've got 180 range. They outrange all archers in the game except Way Watchers. Yeah, they're just insane. They're a very strong unit. There just are builds where you just won't bring these guys because it's just less convenient, more difficult to defend, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't give them like an S tier, but definitely stable A. Archers with light armor, you guys might be a little surprised by this, but they're not going to get an F tier. I'm actually struggling to decide if I think they belong in C or D tier. I think I will give them a D, but I will say that these guys do have a solid niche against factions that bring mortars. The reason being 40 armor actually is the difference between getting one-shotted by a mortar round and being able to tank it. This makes a difference. Artillery does take a while to do its work, and of course there's a lot of RNG involved, so oftentimes it'll hit the periphery of your formation. It won't hit the smack dab in the middle every time, so it's not like the same units are necessarily getting hit every time. And the fact that you can soak up a hit is great. It's actually pretty insane for these guys. Being able to soak up or more reliably sort of tank a mortar hit or two here is valuable against a faction like Empire or Vampire Coast. And if you do, that said, obviously that's just a very niche application. In most cases, if you want to tank your sturdier shooting line, you're going to bring Lothran Seaguard, not these guys. But I do think it's worth mentioning that niche is there, and it's why I'm not going to put them in F tier. Next up, we do have the Lothran Seaguard, who I just mentioned, and first the Unshielded variant. And with these guys, it's a bit of a toughie. They're definitely a very solid anchor unit. I do think they're going to land a B tier here. The reason being that, and the shields are actually going to land a B tier here as well. These units fill what's essentially a similar niche. There are several matchups where you just wouldn't bring these guys, in my opinion, because they're just too expensive. They just don't trade that well into... So the shielded variant does trade well into range if your opponent actually has to fight you within range, but they are very expensive, and oftentimes your opponent will just flank, so Wood Elves will just flank you and shoot you from a different angle or split your attention, that sort of thing. So I do think there are niches where these guys can be very potent. I think they're very good to bring like one or two of them to protect your flanks and protect your archers a bit. At the same time, they are a pricey unit. that bonus versus large doesn't come into effect against hounds and backline disrupt of that nature, so they're oftentimes not actually that good at, or as good at resisting backline harass as you would hope. It will take them forever to kill those units. So while they won't take the losses, they're not really able to shake free easily without help, and you've paid more for them than you have for archers, which then means that you don't have money for, say, Illyrian Reavers to clean up into the backline. But that's why these guys are going to land B tier. Now, Storm Riders, I know... Or actually, we'll get to Storm Riders in a little bit. I should mention some of the other units here. Shadow Warriors, once again, a B tier. I think there's some very powerful niche play for these guys. They're very good against Wood Elves. They are respectable against... Honestly, I found a bit useful against Norska. They can be used against Beastmen. Depending on the build you're going for, they can be very potent. They're pretty nippy. They've got good melee stats. They've got good range, stock, of course, but they are a bit expensive to just use in a straight up shootout. They cost 150 more than Deepwood Scouts. They get no benefit in range combat for that, though. So essentially, they're more expensive Deepwood Scout that can fight off hounds, and that's true. It's not bad. Don't get me wrong. I like Shadow Warriors. I think they're a decent unit, but I just don't think they got the versatility to be used in every matchup, or even in most matchups. You'll bring them occasionally, but they do have a lot of redundancy, I think, with either High Elf Archers or with Illyrian Reavers in that kitey shooty role. And once we get to Illyrian Reavers, you're probably going to see why the Shadow Warriors don't rank that high. Next up, we do have a Sister. Well, we've got, actually, these units both cost the same, but the Sisters of... I've been doing these by cost, but the units by cost, not heroes necessarily. But the Sisters of Avalorn are going to rate... These guys are between A and B tier. I'm tempted. I think I'll give them a B. The reason being that they give the High Elves something they don't have in almost any other fashion. That's ranged AP damage. You have the Bolt Thrower, but the DPS in the Bolt Thrower is abysmal. It takes forever to do its job. All your other options for dealing with big armored monsters come down to melee. You've got Nobles, you've got Phoenix Guard, you've got the Fireborn, you've got Dragons, Phoenixes. All of them are very solid options, so don't get me wrong. But Sisters are your only ranged option, which does make them strong in some matchups. Definitely, oftentimes, even say against Vampire Coast, you can bring like 1 or 2 Sisters, and it can be a big game changer against specific units. You don't have to spam the unit. It's not a unit to bring a bajillion of. But just having 1 or 2 of them can be a huge game changer. Their DPS is insane. Their melee stats are actually respectable. In testing, I believe these guys beat Longbeards in a straight-up fight, which is insane. Like, no shooting involved, I'm pretty sure, is what... Granted, this wasn't testing I did, but it was testing I saw reported on the forums. These guys did beat Longbeards in a 1v1. If I remember correctly, they might have beaten Saurus or come close to beating Saurus in a 1v1. They're insane. These ladies are just nuts. And on top of that, they shoot and do AP, so well, that's the main selling point, and they're good in melee, so... Great unit all around, I think, but definitely just so expensive, so susceptible to enemy ranged fire and cavalry, heavy cavalry, that I don't think they rate above B tier because they're just so niche. Then we do have the Shadow Walkers, and I'm actually going to give these guys an F tier. I'm sorry to say. The big problem is that they're telegraphed like crazy. Your opponent immediately knows they're or has a suspicion that they're coming if you pick Nagaryth, because they're unique to Nagaryth. They cost 1,100. They're basically Shadow Warriors who have poison. Now, yes, they do more damage per shot, but keep in mind, they've only got 45 models like Way Watchers. Keep in mind, these guys cost the same as Way Watchers or Sisters of Avalorn, and they don't really counter anything that the High Elves can't counter already. If you're going to try to defend... So keep in mind, if you're going to try to defend, say, Shadow Warriors against your opponent, counter units like Skirmishers, instead of trying to zone them away with like poison or slow them with poison, you're probably just going to bring Illyrian Reavers to mop that crap up. Their range damage is not great. It's basically the same as Shadow Warriors, just differently distributed because there's only 45 models. Their melee stats are good, but not good enough for a 45 model unit. They're just too expensive, really, is what it boils down to. And they don't counter units that High Elves need countered. If High Elves need to counter backline trash, they're going to bring Illyrian Reavers. If they need to shoot down enemy squishies, they're just going to bring Shadow Warriors. They're much cheaper. And these guys don't really have a niche, in my opinion. I've tried running them. I've even had some success with them, but every time I use them, I feel like there's a better unit I could be using. And so I really relegate them to meme tier. It's a unit you bring to show that it can be done. And that's really about it. And I'm really sorry to say that, because these guys look awesome. They've got an amazing aesthetic. They've got amazing looking weapons, and just they look so dope, but they just don't cut the mustard. Now, going into the Regiments of Renown, we do have the Lothan Seaguard Regiment around, the Riders, the Storm Riders, and these guys are a bit tough. Now, if I rated them purely on my personal experience with them, which is almost non-existent, these guys would probably landed like D tier. I'm sorry to say, but because I've read some of the responses and some of the commentary from top tier High Elf players, I'm actually going to give these guys, I'm going to rate them at B tier. I think they're definitely a bit niche. Supposedly, though, they're very good with Vanguard builds. It's something I personally don't use very much, and it comes down to a lot of my playstyle, but I don't want to over-criticize the unit purely because of my playstyle. But I've seen, for example, Lotus Moon praises these guys. He thinks they're amazing. Perhaps he'd put them as high as A tier. I don't, or maybe even S tier. I don't know. But I don't. They don't really suit my playstyle. I do think they're a niche unit, but I can see how with Vanguard builds, which Elves have a lot of potential for, against squishier factions, especially with Shadow Warriors, with Illyrian Reavers, with their quick heavy cav, their big flying monsters, all that stuff. The Elves have a lot of agility and maneuverability, and these guys could give you a stable frontline anti-large anchor. They also cause fear, which is decent if you need to zone away hounds or cheap trash, because you -8, I believe it is leadership for fear. It's nifty. You get rid of a unit faster, and potentially, if say you've got these guys plus some reavers to clean up some trash, that speeds up the process. Next up, we do have the Evergreen's Court Guard. These guys, unfortunately, I'm going to rate it D tier. Maybe they even belong in F tier, but it's a tough one. They've got very good ranged AP damage. They've, of course, their sister driver. They've got insane melee stats. The problem is that high you're just usually scrounging for cash, and in that situation, the Evergreen's Court Guard are just too expensive. They do have the benefit of that banner that gives more winds of magic, but the simple reality is I don't think that's a good enough item to justify their cost, or bring them usually. You're usually just better off freeing up funds for other backline defense measures, and just getting a normal Sister of Avalor, in my opinion. Finally, we do have the Gray, and these guys are, in my opinion, and I hate to say this, but they're probably an F tier as well. They're Shadow Warriors with Snipe. I quite frankly find them abysmal. You know what? I do think they've got a little bit more of a niche than I will say. I think they've got. I would put them at D tier, and this is probably a bit generous. And these guys are definitely D skewed toward F. The reason they're up here is just because I think they are slightly more viable than Shadow Walkers. They do have a little bit of a niche. You can Vanguard them as a one-off unit and then sort of use them to sneak up on enemy artillery, and they'll gun them down pretty quick and that sort of thing. But they're basically 9 veterancy Shadow Warriors with Snipe. The problem is it's Snipe on such a short-ranged unit, especially one that has to operate as a full unit and isn't super sneaky like, say, a Waystalker. It's very difficult to utilize. You often do not get value out of this trait. Their damage output is no better than a Shadow Warrior's. Their melee prowess is better, but you're paying oodles of money for it. And the fact of the matter is, there are very few matches where I would bring these guys really. Against Empire, I found they have a bit of a niche. Against Wood Elves, you can definitely bring them, but in general, I just don't find them to have the utility and viability of their brethren. I will also note that I actually forgot about the White Lines of Crace, the Regiment of Renown, the Pure Main Company. And these guys are going to, in my book, also probably net a D tier. This is really unfortunate. We've just got so much D tier stuff here. And so these guys have really good melee stats. All things well, they've got good melee stats. I wouldn't say really good. Good melee stats. They got good mobility. They got the same benefits of White Lines, essentially. The problem is they are very expensive. Their perk is Armor Sundering, which is very difficult to get value out of because it's an infantry unit. It's like the Regiment of Renown Hammers, the Peak Gate Guard. Like, you can't guarantee at all that these guys will actually get a fight against the unit you want to Armor Sunder. These guys get put up against like Sister of Slaughter, and they're going to get demolished, and your Armor Sundering is doing absolutely nothing for you. It's a worthless effect, essentially. They also have Guardian, which does not synergize well at all with High Elf play, in my opinion, because most of your High Elf lords are mobile, agile, and you're not trying to stay in a fight with them. You're not trying to like, the chances of you fighting on top of your pure main company are relatively slim, in my opinion. And ultimately, these guys are just pricey, and I find that is just a bit of an issue. You will sometimes bring them just because they are a decent interim unit. They do synergize between Swordmasters and White Lions. They do synergize relatively well with Lord Masters of Hoeth. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, I just don't... the Armor Sundering effect especially is relatively worthless. Because it's just so inconsistent and difficult to get a reliable effect out of. We also note the... wow, I also forgot these guys. So the Dryads, and I should have mentioned them before. That's also my mistake. Dryads, I think, will actually net an A tier here. They actually, so they're unique to Averlorn. They're more expensive than their Wood Elf brethren, though only by 25 gold. The nice thing is they give you chaff clearance, which are foot-based chaff clearance, which normally as high elves you just don't have. So against factions where you're going to be dealing with a lot of foot trash, Dryads are great. It's great to have them. They are just more expensive than the Wood Elf variant, and that's a bit of a downside. Plus, they're unique to a sub-faction, which is a downside. But I think Dryads are very, very strong for the high elves, and I'm going to give them an A. So sorry about that, guys. I should get done with the infantry, but it just slipped my mind. Next up, we do have the cavalry, or the, well, I can do artillery because there's only one to do. Bolt thrower, I'll actually give it a stable B. It's not a stellar unit. It's arguably overpriced. The scatter shot is relatively inefficient. The single shot takes forever to kill anything, but it does counteract enemy artillery very efficiently. I believe the only artillery that reliably outshoots the Eagleclaw Bolt Thrower is the Dwarven Cannon, which basically wins every time in testing. But besides that, the Bolt Thrower is a very stable counter battery piece. That and the hammer. The problem is that, like, against Empire, technically you do beat a great cannon, but Empire will usually bring a hammer of witches, which will trash your bolt throwers. But the bolt thrower is definitely a very solid anti-artillery piece. It can definitely do chip damage over time to big monsters, especially if you bring more of them. It's cheap enough to bring a few of them. Scattershot can be decent in a pinch as a shotgun effect. You can disrupt archer formations, that sort of thing. It's definitely not a terrible tool. And obviously it makes B tier. I think there's a lot of matchups where it's just mandatory to bring, or you really want to bring one or two of them. Like dwarves, it's great to pressure their artillery and to zone away gyrocopters, for example. But that's why it's only making B tier, because it's not really like S tier or A tier, but it's definitely, I think, a more reliable tool than, say, Swordmasters or all these lower units. Next up, we do have Cavalry, and this is going to be a bit of a mixed bag. Illyrian Reavers are going to make... This is a tough one. I'm really fond of Illyrian Reavers. I really like the unit. They're going to make a C tier. But I think the way I use them, maybe it's tough. I really like Illyrian Reavers. I think they're a very stable unit. I'll give them B tier. So the reason being, they're very cheap. They're very efficient in combat. They've got low HP, but because of martial prowess, they've got stellar sustained or stellar initial sustained combat stats. They're very mobile. They're arguably like the best light cav in the game in just straight combat ability. They can actually hold up much more elite cav because of that martial prowess. They can bog them down. They only cost 550 gold, which is 200 cheaper than Illyrian Reavers, Illyrian Reaver archers, which is a tangible benefit. If you just want packline harass and you don't need shooting, these guys are the way to go. They can deal with Centigores and fight way above their weight class against enemy like lighter mobile cav. Or I don't even know how to put it. What is Centigores? Centigores are like a fast medium cav. I don't even know what to call them. But against units like Centigores, these guys will trade very effectively. Another benefit is that because they've got good charge bonus and relatively good melee stats, you can use them as a cheap backline defense. So one of the cool things is that you don't need to bring like Silver Helms necessarily to do backline defense because Illyrian Reavers are just so cheap and efficient. Like other light cav will not clear up bats or dogs that efficiently, but Illyrian Reavers will. And that's why I think they make B tier here. Next up, though, we do have Silver Helms, and these guys, sorry, not an A tier. These guys are B tier as well, in my opinion. Both variants, shielded and unshielded. Because the shielded and unshielded is essentially just a trade-off, and like depending on how much money you have and what exact faction you're trying to counter, it's already a bit of a niche unit, but depending on the faction you're trying to counter, you will bring one of it's a bit of a toss-up. I'd say it's about 50-50 which one you'll bring. Because sometimes that 100 gold is worth saving. Sometimes you don't care about that 100 gold and you'll get the shields and the extra melee defense. Silver Elms, though, they're not great in cav on cav, but they do give you high mass stopping power. They synergize very well with White Lions in the Bretonnia matchup. They can counteract some cav, like for example Wild Riders, relatively efficiently. They're pretty cheap and efficient in that situation. Not terrible against, say, Orc cav, because Orc cav sucks. They're just basically a high mass blocker with solid leadership and higher melee stats than Illyrian. Like, Illyrian Reavers will suffer because of their low armor, so you can't rely on them to hold as well. Silver Helms are just more efficient. Like, if you need to crush, say, light infantry like Sister Slaughter, and this was actually seen in one of the recent replays I casted from Triari and Atticus. We saw how much the Silver Helms can do to like squishy infantry like Sister Slaughter. They can just do work, and that's why they net a stable B tier. Next up, we do have Dragon Princes, and I'm sure a few will be surprised, but these guys net an S tier. There's very few matchups where you won't bring these guys. Sure, there's like dwarves. Like, honestly, that's like the thing with spearmen. You won't bring spearmen probably against dwarves either. But against most factions, at least one or two Dragon Princes are a solid pick. High mass blocker unit. They've actually got the highest mass of any heavy cav in the game, at 1100 mass instead of the 1000, which is apparently the standard for everybody else. Really, they're one of the cheapest elite cavs in the game. They've got very high melee stats, practically immune to fire damage. They've got physical resistance, insane armor at 110, very high melee defense with martial mastery. So all in all, just a great unit. Definitely not what you want to take against enemy heavy cavalry, but combined with other tools like your nobles or your shooting or monsters, they can prove an invaluable asset, and I think they're just stellar. And Fireborn are going to join them here at 8 S tier, because Fireborn are an anti-large cav. As High Elves, you struggle against large a lot. These are one of the best. I don't know if they beat Royal or crit fights. I would assume they don't. Though don't quote me on that because it's not a test I've actually run. But I'm pretty sure they don't. But these guys will beat most heavy cav in a 1v1. They are expensive, but not cripplingly so. They still have they've got, with martial mastery, they've got over 50 melee attack and defense, which is nuts for a cav that only costs 1850. They're functionally unbreakable. They do fire damage, which is often nifty unless you're trying to fight other high elves. You'll never want to bring these guys against high elves. Pro tip of the day: don't bring Fireborn against high elves. But besides that, they're very, very strong and make an easy S tier as well, in my opinion, just because of how hard they counter large sometimes. Finally, and I guess these guys just get rounded in here, we do have the Ithalmar Chariot, and this poor guy goes F tier. This, in my mind, is not even a debate. It's just such a bad unit. Not even that bad. Okay, so, well, actually it is kind of bad. It's an 1100 gold chariot that has no AP, so it's not like, at least a Gore Beast, Boar Chariot, or a Cold One Chariot, or Razor Gore Chariot. All those units have AP. These guys don't. So you don't get AP for an 1100 gold chariot. It's a roster with the Noble, which literally fulfills the same role if put on a chariot, except Noble gets AP and actually kills models because it's a heroic chariot. They're tanky-ish, but that's something you don't give a damn about on a chariot, because if you get caught out by cav, you're dead, and if you get stuck on infantry, you're screwed no matter what. More melee defense is not what you're trying to do. If you're using a chariot properly, you're not stopping. You just keep trucking along. And the other option, of course, is the Tyrion Chariot, which can beat up on light infantry effectively enough. Not as well as an Ithalmar Chariot, but it's cheaper significantly. Does a lot of range damage potentially. Is basically uncatchable by enemy cav, except light cav. And the Tyrion Chariot here is actually going to land itself, in my opinion, a C tier. And this might be, some of you guys might disagree, and I'd actually love to hear what people have to say, because it's not a unit I use very often. In my opinion, it can run over infantry effectively. The range attack is very nice, 165 range, magic missiles, or not, magic damage dealing arrows, I should say. Not like a magic missile. It doesn't shoot like fireballs or something. But very nippy, cheap, cheerful, just a good chariot overall, I think. Obviously still overshadowed by the Noble, overshadowed in the range department by the Illyrian Reaver archers, but a decent enough versatile chariot option. If you just, Illyrian Reavers are more versatile against all targets, whereas the chariot is more effective against just infantry. So it kind of depends what you want there. But Illyrian Reavers will make an easy S tier. Basically, Crucial unit for the High Elves. High mobility, high melee stats for a skirmish cav, literally the highest of any skirmish cav in the game. Especially with martial prowess active. Their stats are basically identical to normal Arena Reavers, except they have bad charge bonus. They have solid enough range damage. Only real downside is cost, but there's just so many matchups where you'll bring these guys because you don't really have to defend them. One of the big problems with, say, archers is that you have to defend them. You have to go wide, and going wide is tough for High Elves. With Arena Reavers, they can defend themselves. If hounds catch them, they beat the snot out of hounds. If they are fighting other skirmishers, they outrange everything except glade riders. They outrange a lot of foot shooting. They're very good as a backline disruptor. They're just stellar overall skirmisher. Which does bring us... Oh, I know. Then the Heralds of the Wind. These guys, I was going to say S tier, but I'm actually going to put them at A tier. And this is difficult for me to say because I love this unit. But the fact of the matter is that oftentimes you don't... Once again, it's just a bit too expensive in some cases. The benefits are good. It's effectively a faster Lyrian Reaver with the combat stats or charge bonus of a normal Lyrian Reaver. And then the archery benefits. But the thing is, they're very expensive, so oftentimes you just want the skirmish potential. Normal Lyrian Reavers are good enough. So these guys just make A tier. I still love them, though. Such a good unit. The 105, I believe, speed is just insane for a ground unit. Literally uncatchable by anything except flyers, theoretically. But in practice, flyers will not catch you. So these guys are just nuts. I guess Glade Riders could catch you, but they're not going to want to fight you in melee. Well, Glade Riders, Handmaiden, sorry. Which does bring us into monsters. And first and foremost, we've got the Eagle. This guy's making D tier. Now, the Eagle is one of those generic units that every roster with, well, not every, but multiple rosters get an Eagle. But the Eagle's not a particularly, there just aren't really very many matchups where you would bring an Eagle. I guess for like some air superiority, it can be okay. For some backline disrupt, it can be okay. It's kind of like a Manticore. It's a bad unit in general, or not an efficient unit in general, but it has the occasional niche. So I think probably a D tier. It's not terrible enough to be F tier, but it's just not something you're going to bring very often. So it does make a D tier here. Next up, we do have Treekin. These guys, in my mind, so this is a little tough. I've seen some very abusive sort of blob builds with Alariel where these guys perform pretty well. But outside of that, they don't really have, in my opinion, that much of a purpose on the High Elf roster. I think they're a bit lower than Dryads for sure. They have potential. They can be very solid as a holding tool. They are obviously more expensive than their Wood Elf equivalent. So I would put them at a B tier. But I do think they're pretty solid there. Phoenixes, these guys will also, and this is a massive B tier, honestly, but I just feel like there's a lot of units on the High Elf roster that warrant B tier. They're just decent units. Like the High Elf roster has all these key units that you're going to bring almost every time in like S and A tier. And then there's these B units that you're going to bring depending on matchup to shake things up or to adjust or adapt to your build. And that's really, these three top tiers are really what's decisive. And then this C and D tier is like more niche stuff. And one thing I guess I should emphasize here is that just because something is in C and D tier doesn't mean that it's not viable or doesn't necessarily have like one or two strong niches. It's just not as many. So I think a Flamesfire Phoenix, cheap tear, great, incredible mobility, does fire damage, does magic damage, which is both very decent. Wow, I still don't have the best access to those things. Has potential to regen all of its HP essentially, which is insane. Has its fire poop, which does do decent amounts of damage, especially against blobbed infantry. Does AP damage, decent at single target sniping, cheap. Again, it's crucial. So it makes B tier, easy enough. The Frostheart Phoenix is going to be a C. I think it has a few niches where its melee attack debuff is very strong. It's insanely tanky and difficult to kill because it's got 48 melee defense, which is just nuts. Like this guy is really frustrating to kill. Decent armor. It's got a temporary ward save as long as magic is high. So in my opinion, a C tier because it's a tank that can disrupt enemy attacks a little bit with that -9 melee defense or a melee attack. But ultimately, it's just too expensive. If you want cheap terror, you're going to bring a Phoenix. its damage output is pretty terrible, and so I don't think it warrants as high as the normal Flamespire Phoenix. Tree Man, this one's difficult because I haven't really used him very much as the High Elves, and I don't really see too many niches for him. The thing is that, like, a Treekin, you throw him on top of, say, Phoenix Guard, and you can use them to disrupt enemy charges. They give you a high mass anchor. A Tree Man could technically do the same thing, but he's much more expensive. And, like, your killing power in that blob is already going to come from Phoenix Guard plus Treekin. Or from the Phoenix Guard, sorry. So, like, the Tree Man doesn't really bring much to the High Elf roster. Generally, if you want to bring if you're doing a bunker build, you're going to be better off with Treekin, Phoenix Guard, and then, like, maybe Dryads for, like, chaff clearance. If you're doing a monster heavy build, it's much more about mobility. High Elves with their phoenixes and dragons, and then supporting elements like dragon princes and archers and that stuff are going to be trying to be mobile, and the Tree Man just doesn't generate that. He's not even a cheap source of terror on the roster because you've got the Flamespire Phoenix. So in my opinion, just makes D tier. It's not a terrible unit. I'm sure there's ways to make him work, but I can't think really of a matchup where I would like honestly bring it. Maybe he's F tier. He's probably D looking at F tier, to be honest, because I just can't think of many matchups where I would bring him. Maybe if I was trying to do something like Death Ball Blob with like Alariel, and just really wanted to go just pure Death Ball, maybe I'd bring this guy. He might actually be closer to F tier. I actually think F tier is probably a more appropriate place for this guy. If you guys disagree, if you found some like superb niche for him, really let me know, because it's just something I haven't tested too much. When I play Everlorn, I actually make use of Dryads and Treekin a lot. I love the units, but the Tree Man, I've never really found him to perform well for me. But the Walmart Dragon, as Tyrion affectionately calls him, the Sun Dragon, makes a easy A tier, I would say. It's a cheap dragon. That's what there is to say. It's got breath attacks, which is great, decent melee stats, decent mobility, good charge bonus, hits like a truck, relatively speaking, for how cheap of a unit it is. Does fire damage, has some missile resist. Easy A tier is where I'll put him. I think if you want that budget terror with a breath, you're gonna bring a Sun Dragon, and I think he'll make. That's why it's just a solid unit. It's not really much to say. It's a dragon. And I think as High Elves, where oftentimes you're cash strapped, the fact that it is a cheap dragon can be nifty. Or if you just need to accentuate your Air Force, you're gonna bring this guy just to flesh it out a little bit, get an extra model on the field. It's not like you can bring multiple Star Dragons really. Well, you can bring a one and a Lord, and if you want to, really, but let's say especially if you're an attorney where you're limited to just one Star Dragon, then you could bring a second, supplement that, and you're more likely to, in my opinion, to supplement it with a Sun Dragon just because it's cheap. Moon Dragon, this one's tough. I actually don't find the Moon Dragon as useful, but I think B tier is probably decent. It's too expensive. Usually, if you're gonna bring a Moon Dragon, you're just gonna suck it up, and in my opinion, pay for Star Dragon because it's just better. And if you're gonna if you're trying to be cheap, you're gonna bring a Sun Dragon and free up 300 gold for other purposes, because the Moon Dragon doesn't have better armor really than the Sun Dragon, or not. It's not really much more survivable, I would say, than the Sun Dragon. Like, it does have more HP and it does have more melee defense and all that, but ultimately it's a very squishy dragon and it doesn't hit that much harder. So I think it's just B tier, leaning towards C tier. Star Dragon though, easy S, and I'm sure people will disagree with this one maybe, but in my opinion, if you see a dragon build with the High Elves, it's almost always going to be. And it's just a very solid, very, very solid unit that you're going to utilize in just a lot of matchups. It can hard counter enemy monsters very effectively because it's just got such monstrous melee stats. Because you're High Elves and you've got insane amounts of healing, it's very easy to sustain. Plus, you're usually going to bring a Castle Lord. So keep in mind, where you're like a princess, if you bring her on, it's not like a situation where you're guaranteed if you're going to bring, like we were talking with the Lizardmen, where if you're going to bring an Ancient Stegodon, you're going to probably bring him as a mount instead. In the case of the High Elves, that's not really the case. There's a good chance you'll bring a Star Dragon just as is. And yeah, monstrous melee stats, hits like a truck, very tanky. 80 armor is not bad. 25% missile resist, all that. Just an insane unit. Easy S tier. One of the things I will admit, it is a little difficult here. In hindsight, I'm debating a few of these initial units that I put in D tier. Because originally I had intended for these guys to be D tier. But now I'm no longer as sure. I think I will put Tyrion, Elithanar, and the Lore Master up to C tier. Be a little bit generous there. I do think they're definitely on the leaning towards D tier side of things. They're not necessarily great, but they do have, I think, a few more niche purposes. When I look at it in hindsight, and the other units I'm putting in D tier, like the Grey, who are incredibly niche, or the Pure Main Company, who I feel are very niche, or Eagles, who you rarely, if ever, see, the Evergreen's Court Guard, or Archers with light armor. I just do feel like you've got more. Tyrion probably does belong in D tier because he's a bit like the Green Knight. That's a tough one. It's a tough one. War Master. It's difficult to decide. I think. Okay, so this is where we're gonna end up. I apologize for retconning the list here, but I think Elithanar does belong maybe in C tier in hindsight, because I gave the Prince a C tier. I gave the Handmaiden a C tier, and honestly, both are very niche units who you will rarely use. But I think Elithanar you will sometimes utilize a bit more just to harass. I've seen some innovative play with him at harassing enemy artillery pieces and crews and that sort of, and sniping at enemy lords. And I think he does deserve a C just for that, even though I personally don't get as much value out of him. But that is my high elf tier list. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope if you guys agree with this, let me know, and think that this is good. If there's units you believe are misplaced, or you found some great uses for them, be sure to let me know. Honestly, stuff like, for example, the Tree Man, because I don't play Avalon that much to begin with, and when I do, I see an easy usage for the Dryads and Treekin, so I often include them, but I don't really see a use for the Tree Man. And I'll straight up admit that maybe I'm missing something there, and if someone's found a great purpose for them, honestly, I'd love to hear about it. Same with some of these D tier units. Maybe you find that they're more reliable than I'm giving credit for. Personally, I just think of some of the overbearing choices towards the upper end of the roster, they don't make it. But who knows? Maybe you guys find otherwise, and be sure to let me know. Let me know in the comments if you agree with this list, if you don't agree, if there's specific stuff you disagree with, or have questions about. As always, let me know. I do have the next 2 videos figured out now, so what I'm going to be doing. But as always, you are free to put up your suggestions, recommendations, or desired units, and I will do my best to get to those as soon as possible. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.